So I'm very pleased to be here tonight. My name is Paula Moya. I'm a professor in the English department and one of the faculty leading this class along with my colleague in political science, Gary Segura, and my other colleague in sociology, Tomas Jimenez. It gives me great pleasure to be here today for this very important panel. As you all know, gender issues in the 2016 presidential campaign have been, as one of the major party candidates might say, huge. There are so many things we could say about how gender has influenced the tenor and the rhetoric of this election season that we can hardly hope to encompass them tonight. The release 2 weeks ago of an 11-year-old tape that provided both audio and visual footage of Donald Trump bragging about moving heavily on women in workplace situations by kissing them and aggressively handling their genitals. I had to figure out how to say that without, I hope that worked for you. Without their consent, mind you, while also making lewd comments about their bodies, has brought the most toxic aspects of the relations between men and women to the forefront of our national consciousness. Now, whether you dismiss Trump's comments as locker room talk, or whether you label the actions he was describing as sexual assault, as I do, the confluence of gender, power, and sexuality has never been more visible. The whole incident has brought back into the national conversation the several indiscretions of Bill Clinton as he was on his way into and then sitting in the Oval Office. As a result, the question of how a woman is supposed to handle herself, not only as the target of unwanted sexual advances, but also as the partner of a man who is making sexual advances on another woman, has become a major problem for Hillary Clinton. Unless we think this issue is only for cisgender heterosexual men and cisgender heterosexual women, let's recall the flurry of legislative efforts over the past year to either provide or deny to transgender men and women access to bathrooms that match the gender they inhabit. When we recall that the campaigns to deny transgender people access to bathrooms that match their gender was justified on the basis that women needed to be protected from sexual assault by men in drag, we are right back to the problem of how the confluence of how gender, power, and sexuality shape our social world. Now, there are so many gender-related issues about which I would like to comment tonight, such as why we now refer to our presidential candidates by their first names. But our time together is short, and we all want to hear from the three brilliant women we have invited to speak to you tonight. Shelley Correll, Ina Coleman, and Jennifer Lawless will undoubtedly touch on some of what I have just mentioned. But the substance of their presentations will take us deep into how gender, particularly as it intersects with race, plays itself out in ways that affect the tenor and the outcomes more generally of political elections, and specifically, of course, of the election that we are all in the middle of right now. Now, I'm going to introduce all three of them very briefly in the order in which they will present tonight, and then allow them to come up and give their presentations, and I will return to help moderate the discussion after they have finished. Shelley Correll, our first presenter tonight, is professor of sociology and also the Barbara D. Finberg Director of the Michelle R. Clayman Institute for Research on Gender. She researches gender, workplace dynamics, and organizational culture, examining how cultural beliefs about gender and work influence the career paths of men and women. Professor Correll was the founding director of the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership and is currently leading a nationwide interdisciplinary project on redesigning work that evaluates how workplace structures and practices can be better aligned with today's workforce. Ina Coleman, who will be presenting second, is a gender equity consultant and the former managing director of the Feminist Majority Foundation, which is the publisher of Ms. Magazine and one of the leading organizations dedicated to advancing the equality of women and girls worldwide. Ms. Coleman serves on the Stanford University's Council of the Humanities and Sciences and also on the advisory board of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And finally, Jennifer Lawless is professor in the Department of Government and the director of the Women and Politics Institute in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Her research focuses on how gender impacts political ambition, and she is the author of Women on the Run, Gender, Media, and Political Campaigns in a Polarized Era, which she wrote with Danny Hayes, Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics, which she wrote with Richard L. Fox, and Becoming a Candidate, Political Ambition and the Decision to Run for Office. A nationally recognized expert on women in politics, Professor Lawless co-authored with Richard L. Fox, It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Correll up to take the stage.
As Professor Moya said, I direct the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, and in that position, I and a lot of my colleagues who are here today, we do a lot of work on women's leadership and are really interested in the way that our stereotypes about leaders, along with our stereotypes about men and women, differentially affect the experiences of women as they move into leadership roles. So given that background, probably not surprising that when Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee for president, the news media started calling me like crazy. They wanted to know, what should we tell Hillary? What should we do? How should she navigate this terrain? And I was really intrigued because no one ever asked me about the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, as if, he did not have a gender. So that one reporter said to me, Hillary has introduced gender into the presidential election process. And what I want to talk about today is Hillary, and I want to talk about her experiences, but I want to talk about Trump as well. And I want to start with a few framing comments. And the first is that gender has always been a part of our presidential election process. In many ways, if we think about running for president in the United States, what the previous candidates who have always been two men have been doing on a symbolic level, at some level, is competing over what are the hegemonic definitions of masculinity in our society. So I want to talk a little bit about Trump and his presentation of a particular form of white masculinity and give some examples of that. The second thing that I want to underscore and for us to keep in mind as I'm talking today is that when we're talking about gender in the presidency and we're talking about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, gender intersects with race and with other social identities as well. And this is important. It's important that when we're talking about Hillary to keep in mind she is a white woman. And if she were not a white woman, things would be different here. And this intersection and the constellation of identities that it creates differentially affects what we might think of as the allowable repertoires that different candidates have to offer in their presentation of their leadership style. So later I'm going to ask you to think about what if Hillary Clinton acted like Donald Trump, for example. Okay, how would people react to that? And is she not aware of that and changing the way that what she sees as allowable? So let's keep these two ideas in mind. And what I want to do then is two things. I want to start off by talking about Hillary, okay, and draw on the research that I've done and other people have done about how gender stereotypes might be affecting the way people respond to her as a political candidate, okay? And I thought I'd start this with some headlines, okay? Let's just see what the newspaper is saying about Hillary, and none of this will be news to you if you've been paying attention to the election compulsively as I have. So I just don't think she has that presidential look, okay? So we've heard this from Donald Trump. Marco Rubio, if this election was a resume contest, then Hillary Clinton would be the next president. So he's kind of acknowledging she has a great resume, and I caught up the rest of the quote, but you can imagine he didn't go on praising her beyond that point. He started to say, but that's not what this election is about. So odd, right? You're hiring someone for a job, and the resume is not what it's about. A lot of accusations that she has been lying, and this is a best-selling Hillary lying doll that you can buy and punch it, and it says different things that are supposed to be lies. So this idea that she's dishonest, we've heard a lot about. She has an angry face. Oh, you can't see down that far. Hillary's shouting her speech, okay? So she's loud, she's shouting, she's angry, okay? And then, of course, we've seen some gender differences in behavior as well. The first presidential debate, a lot of talk about how frequently Donald Trump was interrupting her. Okay, so these are some things I want us to think about. We've heard all these. And now what I want to do is, depending on your social science background, I either want to review a little social science with you on stereotypes or teach it to you, okay? So one way or the other. And so what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how gender stereotypes affect Hillary's, the reactions to Hillary, and in general to talk more about the resistance to women's leadership, okay? And what I want to start off by saying, I teach in the Thinking Matters program for you, those of you who have been here long enough to have been in a Thinking Matters class, a class called Why So Few? Gender Diversity and Leadership. I see someone from that class. And a lot of times when students first come into that class, what they think we're going to talk about is how men and women lead differently, okay? And that the different reactions they have are because men and women are leading differently. But what we've seen very clearly in sociology and psychology is by and large, men and women don't lead differently. Instead, what happens is people react differently to the same behavior offered by a man or a woman, okay? So think shouting Donald versus shouting Hillary and how that might elicit a different response. And we know this comes about because of the way our stereotypes about leadership and our stereotypes about gender affect how we respond to men and women leaders. And I want to talk just briefly about two kinds of stereotypes that are going to have slightly different effects and will help us understand some of those headlines. So the first are descriptive stereotypes, okay? And these are stereotypes widely shared beliefs. We may not endorse them, but it doesn't matter if we as individuals don't endorse them. Lots of people out there do. So widely shared beliefs describing the traits, so they're descriptive, so they're describing the traits of a typical woman and a typical man. Now that's kind of weird to think about, like what's a typical man and a typical woman without a gender, race, sexuality, all that, but bear with me for a second. And one of the things that I think is most important from this literature for thinking about Hillary's experience is in psychology, they kind of summarize the finding with a saying that says, think manager, think male. And basically what that says is that our stereotypes about leaders, and if we think about what that is in the United States, this agentic, active person who takes charge, is self-centered, directing, giving orders, those kind of stereotypes overlap almost perfectly with our stereotypes about men, okay? Whereas they don't overlap at all with our stereotypes about women, okay? And because of this, research has shown, and this is true across 32 different countries, that people are more able to quickly associate men with leadership. Their behaviors just kind of look like leadership than they are with women with leadership. And that's going to have some effects that Hillary's combating. And the second kind of stereotypes I want to talk about are what we might call prescriptive stereotypes, okay? These are these widely shared beliefs about how the traits men and women should have or the traits they shouldn't have. So to differentiate, we might believe at a descriptive level that men are more violent than women, but that doesn't mean we think they should be that way. So these are the shoulds, often thought of as gender rules. You know, how should you be, how shouldn't you be? And I want to just show you what those are with some of the most current data. This comes from 2012. Lori Rudman, psychologist, does a lot of work here. The data I'm going to show you right now comes from our college student sample. I thought that would be more relevant since a lot of people in the room are college students. And they give people a list of traits, and they give them a category like women or men, and I put it in quotes because, again, now we're imagining a woman or a man with no other characteristic, but nonetheless, women and men, and they're asked what's desirable. And people produce really pretty remarkably consistent answers of what's most desirable in women and men. And here's what they are. So women, it's desirable that women be warm, sensitive, cooperative, friendly, helpful, and sensitive to others, okay? Stronger together. Notice Hillary's slogan, right? It's got this communal, we're doing things together, okay? What's desirable for men? One of the most common traits that pops up, leadership ability. That's what's desirable in men. Number one, that's not on the women's category. Aggressive, assertive, independent, ambitious, business sense. Notice very different, okay? Remember his acceptance speech? I alone, he said at the Republican National Convention, okay? Very self-centered, more about self, less about others. What's undesirable, okay? So now here are the top things that come up when you ask somebody what's undesirable. For women, aggressive, intimidating, demanding, angry, and self-centered, okay? Starting to sound like some of the criticisms we've seen of Hillary. Whereas for men, emotional, weak. I don't know if you remember or read about, in case some of you are quite young, when Reagan ran against Carter, there was this whole attempt to paint him as weak, okay? Not supposed to be weak if you're a man. Insecure, indecisive, Bill Clinton flip-flopping, okay? Kind of a man that's, on this undesirable list, naive, okay? So you see the very different kinds of stereotypes. And so now what I want to do is just briefly talk about how these might be affecting what we're seeing in those headlines that I put up earlier. And if we think about the descriptive ones, what we see with descriptive stereotypes is they tend to make it harder for women to be seen as having sufficient leadership ability, okay? It's as if the bar is higher for women, okay? Women have to perform more in those domains to be seen as equally leader-like. Another phenomenon we see is that there often is a shifting of criteria. If you think about evaluating someone for a job, what kind of criteria might you expect them to have? And we see that that criteria often shifts around to favor men when we're talking about leadership. So there's this really cool study in psychology where people were evaluating someone for a police chief position. And what they found is that women, when men had more education, they were more valued, and people would say that's because this person has more education. But when men had more street smart, they'd been on the street longer as a police officer, they would still prefer them and say it was because they had more street experience. So the criteria would shift around depending on what the man had to shift to favor him. I think we're seeing that in this presidential election, because if I look back and ask myself, what are usually the criteria for picking a president? Being in political office before turns out to be really important. Only 4 presidents have never not held political office, and the last was Eisenhower, so long time ago, and he was a military dude, right? So, you know, she's been a president. She obviously has been held political office before becoming president. And if you say what kind of training do they have, lawyers the most common, that's her training, okay? But it seems like something else matters now. Rubio said if it was a resume contest, she would win, and I think that's exactly right, but it's not about the resume, it's about something else. Raising the bar. Women are often judged by a stricter standard. You don't look presidential. And I want to show you an example of how I think we see this by sharing some data with you from the Washington Post. This was way back in July, and if you've been following this election, that sounds like millions of years ago. But they asked people the question, you know, do you think Hillary Clinton's qualified to be president? Do you think Donald Trump's qualified to be president? And you answered both questions. So you could either say yes, yes, no, no, yes, no, no, yes, okay? And what they found was this. 46% of people said only Clinton was qualified, and 30% said only Trump was qualified, okay? So if you just look at this, you think Hillary's winning by a landslide. Well, she wasn't in July, for sure. But for these two first groups, you get just what you expect. If you then ask people, who are you planning to vote for? The people in the first bar said Clinton, and the people in the second bar said Trump, right? And that's usually you think you'd vote for the person who's more qualified. So that's not at all shocking. What's interesting is the last two. So there 11% said neither qualified, 9% said both qualified, okay? And those people all said they would vote for Trump practically. I mean, it was shifted way more heavily towards voting for Trump. So in other words, Trump is being voted for if he's the only person qualified, if both are qualified and neither are qualified. But if Hillary's going to be voted for, she needs to be uniquely qualified. So that's an example of this kind of, I think, harsher standard that Hillary's being judged by. Prescriptive stereotypes, okay, these shoulds, I want to talk about that briefly. For women leaders, this is often the bigger problem. Women leaders, in Hillary's case, I think most people, would have to concede that she seems to be qualified enough for the job. But on a prescriptive level, I think this is where we've seen Hillary encountering even more barriers. When people violate prescriptive stereotypes, when they do things that are sort of out of bounds for what people think women should and should not do, what we often see is a little gender policing, like we're trying to put them back in the box we imagine them to be in. So smile more. How many commentators have told Hillary Clinton that what she should do at the next debate is smile more? I lost count a long time ago. She needs to smile more, okay? But not too much, because when she was talking about her grandchild and smiling, the next day people thought she was smiling too much, as if you wouldn't be smiling talking about your grandchild. I don't know. But smile more. Don't act angry. That's one of the most prescribed behaviors. Don't be so loud, okay? So during the Democratic nomination process and the debates with Bernie Sanders, this was a big criticism of her. She was being too loud. She was shouting. And, arguably she was no louder than Bernie Sanders and certainly no louder than Donald Trump, but yet this is what was happening. In political science, some cool experiments where they have people reading a speech, either like actors, and they're reading a political speech, and a male actor, female actor read the same speech, and they adjust the decibel level till it's exactly the same. People say women are louder, okay? Now, to draw men back into this, these policing of gender rules affect men as well. So Jimmy Carter, being too weak, kind of being called out for that. So when men violate prescriptive stereotypes, they too are kind of policed back in. And these rules are certainly racialized, okay? So if you imagine Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, lately Joe Biden out there campaigning, and they're allowed to be really loud and screaming at people, no way could Obama get away with that, right? So for black men, the stereotypes are, of course, different. different. And the idea of looking angry may be fine for a white man, but not for a black man. So we see race and gender interacting here. And then finally, if I had to single out one thing that I think we've seen that really resonates the most with the kind of research I do, is Hillary Clinton experiencing what we might call the likability penalty, which is a common experience for women leaders. And so what the likability penalty is this: it's hard for women leaders to be simultaneously seen as leader-like and likable. Okay, and so, to illustrate that, imagine Hillary Clinton comes out, she's giving, she's in the debate or something like that, and people say, you need to smile more, you need to be warmer, present a more authentic self, you need to not be so loud. Imagine she did that the next debate, okay? People are now going to see her as being more likable because she looks more like what they expect women to be, but they're going to see her as less leader-like, okay? So it's hard for women to be seen as both leader-like and likable. So, and the interesting thing about Hillary is we might say, well, people just, it's not that, Shelley, you're wrong. People just don't like her. But I think the really important thing to remember is over most of her career, people have liked her a lot, okay? She's liked until she runs for office, okay? She starts running for senator of New York. People just don't like her anymore. Oh my God, I was living in New York at the time. You heard all the same kind of things about her. She becomes senator. She starts doing her job. Her likability goes way up. When she's Secretary of State, she has a 66% approval rating. She's like in Michelle Obama territory at that point in time. In 2015, she was the most admired woman in the United States, and she's held that title for 14 different years. It's really hard for us to imagine now, but people really liked her. But when she runs for office, she's violating this stereotype that women should not be ambitious, and sort of claiming power, and especially claiming probably the most powerful position in the world, is what elicits these ratings. Okay, I'm going to skip over this one because I don't want to take up other people's time, and I want to end by talking a little bit about Trump. And what I want to talk about here is the specific kind of masculine display that Trump is putting on, and why I think it's especially appealing to white men, and especially white working class men at this point in time in American history. And I want to just start by saying why I'm focusing on white men here, and that is that when we look at the so-called gender gap in voting, and if you've been following the presidential election at all, you sort of see that people are presenting all these graphs that if only women voted, this is how things would look, and if only men voted, this is how things will look. That gender gap in voting is mainly about white men who have largely supported Republican candidates over Democratic candidates for quite some time. But these white men on the left often had a very different gender presentation style than Donald Trump does. I mean, George H.W. Bush, it's really hard to imagine him acting the way that Donald Trump is acting. So it's a different kind of masculine presentation, and one that I'm going to give some examples of it here in a second, but I think is especially appealing to white working class men and maybe some white middle class men as well at this point in time in our history, okay? Make America great again, okay? What we're imagining is there was some point in time in the past when life was great and we want to get back to it, okay? So for whom is that true, okay? So if we think about white working class men in some period undefined in the past, they had certainly more power over their families, okay? They had more power over women in general, okay? The kind of lewd remarks, could be made then, okay? And they had more economic power at the time as well, when union jobs were more plentiful, and because of the discrimination in the labor market, they kind of had the corner on a lot of different jobs. And so while other men in society certainly aren't just doing great today either, they didn't have the much better period in the past to compare this to. So I think it's a loss of power. Into this comes Trump, who is going to tell it like it is, make America great again, and the appeal he presents is very much a kind of a particular type of white masculinity that I want to display. And I'm going to end with a few headlines, just like I did with Hillary, but as we're looking at these headlines, I want us to do a thought experiment, and I always encourage this. If you're ever having a negative reaction to a person and you want to try to ask yourself, is this seem to be about gender or race? Try to imagine a different person doing the same thing. So what if Trump were a woman doing the same exact thing, okay? Or what if Hillary acted like Trump? Or what if Obama behaved similarly to Trump, okay? So here are the quotes that I'll end with. Okay, this came from one of the readings that I put in the reading materials. Trump is in many ways a caricature of a man's man. He shouts and bullies and berates people, okay? Now imagine Hillary doing that, okay? She's just loud when she's giving her speech. I mean, imagine that. He speaks mostly in superlatives. He mentions himself in most sentences, so it's all about me, okay? So it's a very agentic, self-centered kind of presentation of masculinity, and it's gruff and rough, belittling people kind of behavior. Trump defends the size of his penis. I guess I should have said genitals too, but Trump decides this, so it's this kind of, it's this sexualized version as well, okay? And it's not just sexualized, it's the lewd remark tape we heard about. It's sexual with the right to women's bodies, okay? So it's power over women's sexuality, and it's violent as well. And it's incited violent in some of the riots we've seen, but it's been picked up by his followers in Indiana 2 weeks ago. This a parade float, and an otherwise just nice little community-oriented parade had a Donald Trump executing Hillary Clinton, okay? So notice this particular kind of masculinity, and that's what I think is different right now, and why we're seeing a really large gender voting gap, and particularly amongst white men, and more so working class white men than college educated men. I'm going to get off the stage and turn it over to my colleague, but I would just say that if you're interested in the men aspect of this, some of you heard Jackson Katz when he was here last year speaking on campus about something else, but he has a great book that sort of traces how gender and masculinity has played out in elections prior to this one. And then we just ask that you would please vote on November 8th.
Thank you for coming out tonight, and we did give a shout out to the Stanford class of 1981. Our reunion is this week, and a couple of them in the audience, so thanks for coming. I'm going to get to it because we've got a lot to cover here. So, oh boy, the gender gap, how it influences this choose your adjective presidential election. You can choose unbelievable, crazy, crude, disgusting, insane, sexist, enlightening, divisive, mean, racist, historic, draining, never-ending, nutty, desperate, full of lies, narcissistic, funny, sad, egotistical, and just plain tiring. I think we're all just really tired. What exactly is the gender gap? It's the difference between the proportions of women and men who support a given candidate, generally the winning candidate. It is the gap between genders, not within a gender. So for all of us Stanford nerds, here's an equation. Percent women for leading or winning candidate minus percent men for leading or winning candidate equals the gender gap. But before looking at the gender gap, it's important to note there are more women in the US electorate than men, giving women a numerical advantage in elections. Women vote at higher rates than men since 1980. By 2014, women constituted 52% of the electorate with a 43% turnout, compared with men at 48% of the electorate and a 41% turnout. With a 6 million vote advantage, women constitute a potentially powerful group. The gender gap across presidential elections, you see it right there yourself. This, in 1972 and 76, so there really was no difference in candidate support between men and women. And since 1980, there's been the gender gap I was talking about. And as you can see, in 2012, there was a 10 percentage point gender gap. 55% of women voted for Obama over Mitt Romney, compared with 45% of men. But the gender gap is not to be confused with the women's vote. The women's vote, the division in women's support for major party candidates in any given race, is percentage point advantage that one candidate has over the other among women voters. And that is the difference in women's support for Democratic and Republican candidates. Percentage women for leading party's candidate minus percentage women for trailing party's candidate equals the women vote. This next slide has, which is from the Presidential Gender Watch, which Rutgers Center for American Women Politics, it's an incredible resource if you want to know everything going on with gender in the election. And you can see there on the two columns, you've got the women's vote and the gender gap and all the equations I just talked about. And there's differences. You've got the 16-point gender gap versus the 22-point women's vote. And just at top. But if you're interested, you can click on those links and you can look at the different polls and how they come up with it. There's a lot of polling going on, as you know. Over the last 9 presidential elections, women have consistently voted for the Democratic presidential candidate at higher rates than men. These next two slides, this first one, are from the Pew Research Center. They, along with other research institutes, have looked closely at gender in this election and raised the question if the long-standing gender gap in American politics could grow even wider in this 2016 election. And I don't need to read it to you, but you see they follow the gap we just talked about, and then the leaning, and the leaning, women leaning, ended up voting. This slide from Pew is just in general Clinton and Trump's preferences. And you can look at it yourself and go take a look. And it's from June, I apologize, but I was hesitant to show it to you because a lot's happened since June. But we'll just talk about it quickly. So you'll see on the left that people of color are, going for Clinton, and the 35 to 49 age group, she leads in that, primarily among women, and almost splits it with Trump among men. And you see on the right side, as far as empathy and judgment, that women think that she understands them better than Trump. Gee, wonder why. And again, that was June. And under judgment, there's a difference in how women and men think. So again, the Pew Research Center, they do amazing research on all of this. So if you get a chance, you want to go take a look. What's behind the gender gap in voting? I'm going to give you a break from charts and graphs right now and just talk about why there are such distinct differences and preferences in how women and men view candidates and vote. It's the differing life experiences of women and men. Women and men have varied opinions on policy solutions, political issues, and societal priorities. For example, differing views on the appropriate size and role of the federal government. Men are more likely to favor cutbacks and reducing the size and scope of the government. Women are more concerned than men about preserving the social safety net. Women are more likely than men to see sex discrimination as a problem. A 2015 Pew report noted that almost 67% of women say there is at least some discrimination against them in society today. Only 48% of men agreed. According to Pew Research, women place a higher level of importance on the treatment of racial and ethnic minorities than men do. 69% of women say this is very important compared with 56% of men. Women want an economy that works for them and their families, which means closing the gender pay gap and offering more workplace flexibility. 85% of women, compared to 67% of men, say they favor a law that would create a national paid family and medical leave fund. And caregiving responsibilities fall mainly to women. Women are more likely to live in poverty, and the majority of those in low-paid jobs. And we're running out of time, but as far as abortion is concerned, over the years, a majority of both men and women across all racial and ethnic groups have supported legal abortion in certain circumstances, but women feel more strongly about abortion and are more likely to factor it in their candidate preference. A 2016 Pew poll found that 52% of women say the issue of abortion will be very important to their vote this fall, compared with just 38% of men. And regarding sexual violence on college campuses, again, differing perspectives. A 2015 Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation poll of college students found that 41% of college women rated sexual assault a big problem or somewhat of a problem, compared to 33% of men. When asked whether a woman who reports a sexual assault will be criticized by other students, 42% of women said it was very or somewhat likely, compared to 29% of men. And healthcare issues, there's a difference. And there's clear differences between women and men on national security, marriage equality, LGBTQ rights, the environment, and renewable energy. The gender gap offers a powerful tool in making women's differing viewpoints visible, which should compel politicians to address women's concerns and demands for equality. The better informed the narrative, the more women's voices and opinions and votes are respected, the more powerful the gender gap becomes. Up there on the right, the suffragette Susan B. Anthony said back in 1872, "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex." How true and how poignant it is. That was so relevant for today. However, women voters are not a monolithic block. Neither are men. There are significant differences that exist among women voters, particularly along ideological and racial ethnic lines. Unmarried women vote differently from married women, Republican to Democrat, college-educated to not college-educated, white women to women of color, Latinas, Black women, and Asian women vote differently. And I could talk about each of these differences for hours, but I'm going to focus on women of color, so let's get to it. Women of color voters, they're a significant influence you may not be aware of, but let's first review the changing demographics of the USA. The United States is truly becoming a colorful nation. By 2043, whites will no longer be the majority in the US. In 2013, America's racial ethnic minorities have made up half of the under 5 age group. By 2018, it's projected that minorities will make up more than half of the children under 18. A new record, 14% of the country's population is foreign-born, compared with just 5% in 1965. Over the next 5 decades, the majority of US population growth is projected to be linked to new Asian and Hispanic immigration. American attitudes about immigration and diversity are supportive of these changes, for the most part, saying immigrants strengthen the country than, say, burden it. And most say that the US's increasing ethnic diversity makes it a better place to live. Women of color will make up just more than half of this emerging majority. Therefore, it becomes clear that this is new reality points, and they're altering the political landscape, one in which women of color may wield a great influence. Women of color, a growing force in the American electorate, constituting more than half of the vote-eligible people of color at 53%, 35 million eligible voters. Now, while not a monolithic group, women of color comprise an important demographic that can, when acting in concert on issues of common concern, have a profound impact, not just on elections, but on public policy as well. The women of color are defined as Black or African American, American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander and Hispanic or Latin. That's from the Census Bureau. Women of color represent 74% of the growth in eligible women voters since 2000, while the voting eligible population, VEP, we're at Stanford, we have to have an acronym somewhere, has increased by less than 6%, about 4.4 million eligible voters. Over the past 8 election cycles, the VEP of women of color has increased by nearly 10 times that at 55%. This translates into more than 12 million new eligible women of color voters. For example, California has experienced the largest increase in real numbers of any state, 2.6 million women of color since 2000, followed by Texas at 1.7 million voters. Among women of color's VEP, Asian women and Latinas have grown at the fastest rates. Asian women saw the largest growth as a share of their sides, an increase of 107%, or 2.7 million voters since 2000. Latinas, who represent nearly half the growth of women of color's VEP and almost 35% of the growth of the total VEP for women of all races, realized an increase of more than 82%, or 5.9 million additional vote-eligible Latinas since 2000. And Black women's VEP has grown by 20.6% since 2000, adding 2.6 million voters. With more than 15 million eligible Black women voters today, Black women represent the largest share, 43% of vote-eligible women of color, and 13.4% of all vote-eligible women. Voting their voices. In July, a Pew Research poll showed that among Hispanic women, 71% say they support Clinton, while 19% say they support Trump. That was July. This is October, so a lot's happened, so those numbers are probably different. Latinas have outvoted their male counterparts in every presidential election since 1984. They were also the most likely Latinas to support Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, with a 4-point gender gap. In 2008, that grew to 11 points in 2012. Black women have the strongest turnout among women of color In both 2008 and 2012, Black women turned out in such large numbers that they were actually overrepresented in the electorate, meaning that they were a higher proportion of the electorate than of their share of the voting eligible population. They participated at a slightly higher rate than white women in 2008 and were 4 points higher than white women in 2012. In 2008 and 2012, 96% of Black women voters cast their ballots for Barack Obama. In fact, in the last election cycle, Black women registered and voted at the highest rate of any group of voters across race, gender, and ethnicity. Black women had a turnout rate of 70%. They were followed by white women at 66%, white men at 63%, and Black men at 61%. Women of color were integral to President Obama's 2 presidential victories, especially given their high voter turnout rates and support for the Democratic Party. When energized, women of color participate in high rates that can affect electoral outcomes. Clinton and Trump and gender, oh my. The most gendered election in history because of the first time a woman's been nominated by a major political party, and also the first time in history a major party's candidate's pattern of disrespectful treatment of women so dominated the daily election coverage for months and months and months. Trump and Clinton are equally historically disliked. Yay for equality. Even after what I've presented so far, I just want to make sure it's clear that most of the electorate does not like either candidate. Clinton and Trump both have made election history with their unfavorable ratings. So you can see in April, the graph on the left is much higher than any other presidential candidates or even sitting presidents. And then the graph on the right from September to October, it pretty much has stayed the same, except Trump's went up, from 61 to 64, from September 12th to October 11th. So it's not good for either of them. Their standing among genders, as we all know, is widely different. Clinton and Trump's gender strengths and weaknesses. So I'll try to get through this quickly, because there's a lot to talk about. So if I skipped any information here, please come find me after. I'm happy to share it with you. All women, according to a recent Atlantic Journal PRRI poll from like a couple of days ago, women support Clinton at 61% compared to Trump's 28%, a commanding 33% now. Other polls show different numbers, and election events change daily, so I wouldn't count on that. White men, according to a July 2016 New York Times CBS poll, white men prefer Donald Trump almost 2-to-1, 55% to 29%. And this is analyzed, as you heard earlier, as Hillary Clinton has a white male problem. I'm not sure, that was July, I'm not sure what the current October numbers are. Barack Obama lost to John McCain among white men 40% to 60% and still won the presidency. And it was difficult to find current polls about white women because the media likes to break it down by everything by and white women and white men by college and not college educated for some reason. So I apologize that I don't have the most recent white women polls. Non-college working class white men, as you heard from Shelley, according to a September poll, Trump leads Clinton among the non-college educated white men by 59% to 60% around there, and Mitt Romney won them in 2012 by 31%. As Shelley talked about, it seems that the white working class have found their voice in Trump. He speaks directly to conspiracy, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness, and they're grateful he speaks to them. Recently, Trump told a crowd that in a certain way he considers himself a blue-collar worker. In light of Trump's focus on concerns of white working class men, there is reason to believe that this electorate's turnout will increase compared with similar elections, with earlier elections. Since at least the 2000 election, white non-college men turned out to vote at markedly lower rates than white college graduate men. In 2012, the respective turnout rates were 59% to 79%. Non-college working class white women. If you look at the white working class Americans without a college degree, the majority, 53%, are women. Poll numbers before the tape is he was ahead by 12 points among working class white women. Poll numbers after the tape indicate that Clinton and Trump are about even in this electorate category now, each drawing about 40% support. Right now, the numbers suggest that within that white working class group, women's interests appear to be diverging from their male counterparts. And it seems that that could counterbalance Trump's lead among white working class men. As stated above, the rationale for Trump's candidacy is that he's the champion of the hardworking Americans that the elitists have left behind. But many of those hardworking Americans are women. And important to women of this group is paid leave, child care, minimum wage, and equal pay. When it comes to Trump, many white working class women find him unappealing for exactly what turns off college-educated women: his demeanor, his divisiveness, his language, and his crudeness. Unmarried women comprise about 25% of the electorate, and they seem to vote liberal and Democratic. In 2012, they voted 67% to 31% for Obama. Millennial women. Many are for Clinton, but also many are driven less by support for Clinton than by extreme disgust for Trump. In July, while 7 of 10 young women supported Clinton, at that time by more than 2 to 1, their choice is more a vote against him than for her. College-educated white women. In August, after the convention, Clinton's advantage with his electorate was 57% to Trump's 38%. Similar to how women of color are a voting bloc that can tip the election in Clinton's favor, it's also likely that this year's election could be historic by making white college-educated women a linchpin of a decisive Democratic victory. This electorate is possibly voting for Clinton in the largest numbers seen, and it's an unintended consequence of Trump's misogynistic and degrading comments and revelations of his sexual predatory behavior toward women. The Brookings Institute did a really very thorough analysis of these two electorate groups, white working class men and white educated women. I don't have time to detail all of it here for you, but their analysis indicated that if Clinton can sustain and continue to add support from white educated women, as shown in recent polls, she will overcome the significant turnout of white working class men. College educated white men seem to be about 50% Clinton. People of color. As discussed previously, a majority of women and men of color are supporting Clinton. In an August poll, 85% of blacks and 52% of Hispanics supported Clinton. In a September poll, that was up to 98% of blacks for Clinton. Women of color. I previously discussed women of color and their voting preferences and impact. But I'll quickly point out that Clinton is seeking to capitalize on the reliability of Latinas in this election, as well as the high rate of growth among eligible Latina voters in recent years. Of course, people of color are not a homogeneous group, so there are black men and women and Latina and Latinos voting for Trump. However, especially in this election, it seems they will be the minority in the minority. Lastly, I just want to comment on what's going on with the white working class men that we are hearing and seeing about and their thoughts and feelings. And it seems they're being convinced that paying attention to race and gender is an attack on them, and it is not. Yet Donald Trump and some of the Republican Party are framing it that way. And it's perceived as an attack because whiteness and maleness, not class, have come to define the white working class. And it seems like that's exactly what a large part of Trump's campaign is about, appealing to voters that want to return to America's past. They blame the U.S.'s changing demographics on the economy and other challenges in their lives. And it seems they're believing that racial diversity and inclusiveness is hurting them. And as you're aware of this divisiveness and hate you see at Trump rallies, consequently, this election will likely divide demographic voting blocs like never seen before. The impact of Trump's misogyny. You know, how many of you heard or saw Michelle Obama's speech from a few days ago? Oh, great. Well, I was going to read this, but I probably don't need to now. But, you know, her speech a few days ago summarized the impact perfectly. And if you haven't watched it or read it, I strongly suggest you do so because it lays out all that's wrong and unacceptable. So I encourage you to read it and watch it. I don't have time to share it entirely with you. And I was going to read some parts of it here, and I'll just read a little bit of it, but it cannot be communicated more eloquently. I only have 2 slides left, so I'm hurrying up. I know it's a campaign, but this isn't about politics. It's about basic human decency. It's about right and wrong, and we simply cannot endure this or expose our children to this any longer, not for another minute, and let alone for 4 years. Now is the time for all of us to stand up and say enough is enough. Enough is enough. This has got to stop right now. Because consider this, if all of this is painful to us as grown women, what do you think this is doing to our children? What messages are our little girls hearing about who they should look like, how they should act? What lessons are they learning about their values as professionals, as human beings, about their dreams and aspirations? And how is this affecting men and boys in this country? Because I can tell you that men in my life do not talk about women like this. And I know that my family is not unusual. And to dismiss this as everyday locker room talk is an insult to decent men everywhere. Well, fortunately, here's the beauty. We have everything we need to stop this madness. You see, while our mothers and grandmothers were often powerless to change their circumstances today, we as women have all the power we need to determine the outcome of this election. We have knowledge, we have voice, we have a vote. And on November the 8th, we as women, we as Americans, we as decent human beings can come together and declare that enough is enough, and we do not tolerate this kind of behavior in our country. It was an amazing speech, and even some of the Republican conservative pundits and media, they really liked it. And that was nice. That was really nice to see. My only comment on all of this is that I think more Americans are concluding that a president of the United States cannot represent or speak for the American people if she or he despises and degrades half of them, based on all the data and information you just heard. In my opinion, the 2005 tape where he bragged about sexually attacking women, adding that to the courage of the women who are coming forward who've been victims of these unwanted advances, now that they know they're not alone. All of that has sealed one of the last nails in the coffin of Trump's presidential bid. Particularly, the gender gap of the percentage of women over men for Clinton will be more than the gender gap of the percentage of men over women for Donald Trump. Therefore, it's predicted by many that Hillary Clinton will win the presidential election, and we will witness the largest presidential voting gender gap in her story. Like in 2008 and 2012, women of color's high voter turnout will add millions of votes to that gap that were playing a critical factor in defeating Donald Trump. So the tombstone of the presidential election will read, "Rest in peace, Donald J. Trump, 2006 presidential election bid, born June 16, 2015, ended November 8, 2016. Women and men across the United States freshened their breaths with Tic Tacs, walked into voting booths, closed the curtain behind them, and grabbed Donald Trump by his ballots. Ballots. What's left with 22 days to go? Vote. And if you can, help get out the vote. And make sure that everyone you know here in California and elsewhere votes. And speaking of California, don't get overwhelmed by this intense, long, 225-page voting guide. I have 3 young adult kids who will be voting in the election, and my youngest, Sloane's here tonight. She's turning 18, voting in her first election. She's a sophomore here at Stanford. Sloane, some quality mom and daughter time to go through this 225 book. Fun times? No, right. But seriously, don't get overwhelmed and just vote on what you're informed on. And if that's the presidency only, that's fine. If you're educated on the different measures, great. If not, that's fine too. Most important is you get to the polls and you vote. So let's keep the conversations going. Thank you. I'm going to be at TED Women next week, and I'll be tweeting from there, any kind of pearls or nuggets, and there's my information up on the slide. So thank you, and if you have any questions, let us know.
I am going to try to keep my remarks to about 15 minutes, so I speak fast, which is natural, but that way we'll have plenty of time for questions. What I want to talk about today are the elections, but not only the presidential election. There are also 500,000 other elected offices in this country, literally 510,000, and people are going to be casting ballots for a lot of those positions as well. So what role does gender play in those races, and what role does gender play when you're thinking about running for office yourselves? So this is the cliche standard slide that goes beyond the presidential election. Women are gold, men are purple, and it doesn't really seem that striking to you, but men are overrepresented in all political institutions across the country, whether we're talking about the US Congress, governor's mansions, state legislators, or city halls. And we actually currently rank 95th globally in the percentage of women serving in the national legislature. To put this number into perspective, when I was a graduate student at Stanford in the fall of 1999 and I started my research on women in politics, the United States ranked 57th. So over the course of the last 17 years, the rest of the world has sort of gotten it in a way that the United States has not. And basically, one of the major reasons, I chose the most flattering photo I could find. One of the major reasons that people argue we have so few women in politics has to do with bias and discrimination. And what I'm going to try to argue today is that although there are definitely episodes of bias and discrimination, we've gotten to the point in US politics where that's actually probably not the main reason that is keeping women out. Now, when women run for office at both the state and local level, as well as at the federal level, they're just as likely as men to win their elections, and they raise just as much money. This is the case both in primaries and in general elections. It's just not a really sexy story, so we don't hear that much about it. There is this notion, though, that even if women and men are able to win elections at equal rates, women traverse a more difficult playing field. And the political landscape that they confront is far more complex and complicated than it is for men. So they should probably, if they're similarly situated candidates, be winning at even greater rates. But sexism and discrimination is reducing those levels of victory. And so we hear this all the time. Nancy Pelosi in 2008 said, of course there's sexism. We all know that. It's a given. She was speaking about Hillary Clinton's defeat. Katie Couric, one of the lessons of the Clinton campaign is the continued and accepted role of sexism in America, in American life, the media in particular. She was also reflecting on Clinton's campaign. Michelle Bachmann said recently, this goes on both sides of the aisle, many voters just aren't ready for a female president. Allison Schwartz, who ran for governor in Pennsylvania last time around, said the political pundits, the media, the Harrisburg establishment couldn't believe a woman could serve as governor, couldn't even imagine it. Carly Fiorina, you might recall, Katie Couric asked her whether she was actually just running to be vice president. And her response is, oh, Katie, would you ask a male candidate that question? Turns out, yes, she actually asked all of the candidates that question, but let's put that aside for a second. An organization called Name It, Change It, which is part of the Women's Media Center and the Women's Campaign Forum, has actually created what they consider a pyramid of misogyny, where people are asked to identify every sexist thing they read about a candidate in the newspaper and log it. And this is their scheme, not mine, but sexism goes from the just plain sexist commentary to the really damn sexist to the severe misogyny. You can figure out where your statement goes, but it's to sort of call attention to how poorly the media are handling this. And my favorite woman in politics, Selena Meyer, recently said when Julia Louis-Dreyfus was interviewed by Entertainment Weekly, she said, upon learning how to be a female vice president and then president. I was fascinated by how people are so judgmental about how women look, and male politicians don't get that. A change of hairstyle often gets more attention than legislation they're trying to put forth. So there's this general sense that, fine, maybe it's the case that women are just as likely as men to win elections, but certainly they're enduring a lot more along the way. And we've seen that not only at the presidential level, but when we're talking about running for governor or running for Congress, those same kinds of statements emerge. And in fact, based on a national sample of voters, Danny Hayes and I conducted a study in 2014 and found that that's generally what the American public believes too. 60% of people believe that the media focus too much on a candidate's appearance. 58% think that women are subjected to sexist media coverage. Almost 50% think that women have to be more qualified than men to win their elections and that they face bias from the voters. And about a third believe that women don't win as often and can't raise as much money. And we see examples of this all the time. A couple of years ago, Joni Ernst, who was the newly elected female senator from Iowa, the first time Iowa elected a woman to Congress, she gave the response to the State of the Union address, and the coverage was about her camouflage high heels. And so this plays into this narrative that, and we can all think of examples of women being treated in a way that men are not when they run for office. But then, you might remember this summer, which we called the audacity of taupe, where Barack Obama actually went up to the podium wearing a taupe suit, and that was seen as a major faux pas. You might recall that Chris Christie gets quite a bit of attention regarding his appearance and whether his weight is an issue. And Paul Ryan, when he was running for vice president in 2012, received many, many headlines dedicated to the fact that he just couldn't seem to find a suit that fit. So we might be moving to the point right now where it's not only women who are receiving this kind of coverage. And so in Women on the Run, you should all write this down and buy it. It's a new book. It's really riveting. It's not so riveting, but I encourage you to buy it anyway. Danny Hayes and I undertook a pretty systematic investigation of what happens when women run for office, because we felt like it's very easy, especially with the Trump-Clinton race and a woman, or in 2008, Hillary Clinton against Obama, to come up with these broad generalizations of what it must be like to be a female candidate. But running for president is probably, or possibly, a lot different than running for these other 510,000 elective positions. And Hillary Clinton is certainly unusual and probably qualifies as unique in terms of the type of candidate that she is and the background that she has. So we wanted to investigate a little bit more broadly what happens when most women run for Congress. So we focused on Congress, and I just want to give you a brief, quickie overview of the data, and then I'm going to show you some of our key findings. So the first thing was we looked at 498,000 campaign ad airings from 2010. We focused on the 2010 and 2014 House elections, as well as 56,000 candidate tweets from 2014. Basically what we did were, these were the ads that aired 30 days before the election in 2010, and these were the tweets that the campaign sent 30 days before the actual general election in 2014. Then we analyzed local newspaper coverage of about 11,000 articles. We identified the largest circulating newspaper in every congressional district in both 2010 and 2014. We collected any article that mentioned the name of a major party candidate, and then we identified everything about those articles, the content, whether the candidate's appearance was mentioned, whether the candidate's traits were mentioned, what traits were mentioned in association with the candidate, what issues were mentioned in association with the candidate. You're probably thinking, wow, you're old, no one reads the local newspaper. Not true. Turns out that in House races, local newspapers are actually the main source of news for people. That's somewhat quaint and cute, but the reality is that when you think about political blogs, when you think about national TV, when you think about cable news, talk radio, they're talking about the presidential race. They're talking about some really high-profile Senate races. They're not talking about your House race. You still look to your local newspaper for House race coverage. We did national surveys with voters in 2010 and 2014, asking them about what was going on in their House races. That's 3,000 people. And then we actually did interviews with 75 local journalists, campaign managers, and party officials. And what did we find? Well, nothing. It's a book of nothing. I encourage you to read it. So let me quickly first show you about issue content. So these were the ads that the campaign sent. The left panel is Democrats, the right panel is Republicans. What you need to do is compare the yellow bars, which are the women, to the purple bars, which are the men. And if you notice, these are basically the profiles. What kinds of issues did the candidates talk about in their campaign ads? The economy, social welfare, taxes and spending, defense and security, civil and social order, government functioning, and foreign affairs. Race and social groups don't show up because although that's a category, they don't talk about them. What we see here is that although there are some differences between Democrats and Republicans, there really aren't within each party gender differences across these different issues. So women and men are talking about the same kinds of things in their campaigns. Women are talking about these traditionally male issues like taxes and spending or defense and security, and men are talking about social welfare. I could show you a slide that looks very, very similar if we break it down by the sex of the opponent. What men talked about did not vary based on whether they were running against a man or a woman. Democrats say the same thing regardless of whether they're men or women, and Republicans do too. Tweets, generally the same story. The only difference here was if you look at men's issues, which are just a subset of a lot of these other issues, women were actually more likely than men to talk about them on the Republican side of the aisle. But certainly that was not coming at the expense of talking about these other issues. We see no real gender differences. Okay, well, maybe women are talked about more in terms of their appearance, or maybe they get coverage that talks about the fact that a lot of these traditional gender stereotypes are how we should be evaluating them, right? If traditional gender stereotyping is still happening in political contests at the congressional level, then women should be more inclined to get trait coverage that emphasizes their empathy or their integrity. Men should be more likely to get coverage that emphasizes their leadership abilities or their competence. And so what we did was we went through and we looked at every time a candidate's appearance was mentioned, all the different traits mentioned, and the issues. And let me just show you the gender stuff first. So the one category was all gender mentions. So these were any mentions that were about the candidate's family, their appearance, or anything else that cued you into the fact that it was a man or a woman running for office. That could also involve attempts to sway female voters, or when they were talking about the war on women, right? So the top is the total amount. All of these are subsets of that. Most importantly, notice the x-axis. It only goes to 2. So the average number of mentions about a candidate's gender in the 2010 and 2014 elections was 1. So on average, in 30 days of newspaper coverage, there was 1 mention that would in some way cue you into a candidate's sex. And it didn't differ for women or men. More importantly were the appearance mentions. 96% of male candidates, we're talking about more than 800 candidates, 96% of male candidates and 95% of female candidates received 0 mentions of their appearance whatsoever. So this is more evidence to suggest that what goes on at the presidential level does not describe the landscape that most people that are running for office face. Now you might be thinking, but what do these appearance mentions look like? Maybe they're talking about how strapping and great the men are and how terrible the women are. Let me just show you a couple. Not so flattering. That's Jim McDermott, a Democrat in Washington. He got covered in a newspaper article because he actually showed up wearing that at a museum opening. This is Blake Farenthold, a Republican. It's important to be bipartisan. He went to a slumber party and wore flannel pajamas with duckies. That was also one of the articles. So we're not really talking about women and men being covered in ways that are so, differentially flattering or unflattering. In fact, 18% of the appearance mentions regarding female candidates had to do with the fact that Tammy Duckworth, who's now running for the Senate in Illinois but was running for the House, lost limbs when she was in Iraq, because that cues you in to think about how she looks and what she physically embodies. That's certainly not a superficial appearance mention. All right, what about traits? Same story. I told you we've got null findings. Gold bars are women, purple are men. We broke the traits up. We coded about 250 different traits, but we then broke them up into positive and negative. And did they tap into competence, leadership, empathy, or integrity? None of these differences is statistically significant. So men and women on both sides of the aisle were equally likely to be described as strong or not strong leaders, competent or incompetent, empathetic or lacking in empathy, trustworthy or not. And when we get to issues, again, basically the same story. A lot of issue coverage, on average about 25 mentions of issues over the course of a month's worth of coverage, but no real gender differences. So whether we're looking at the candidates' communications or the media covering them, we don't see much. How do the voters assess them? Well, here, I'm sorry, this is a rookie mistake. Here the purple are women and the gold are men. It's terrible. I'm asking you to think in ways that your brains don't work because you've just gotten accustomed to my beautiful slides. Among the Democrats, when we asked people to assess the candidates on a 10-point scale, these were the candidates running for the House in their district. It's a 10-point scale. Nobody really did much better than a 6. But women and men who are Democrats are evaluated similarly on national security, crime, the economy, healthcare, and even abortion. And the same thing is true for Republicans. So voter assessments, media coverage, and candidate communications all look very much the same. What matters is whether a person has a D or an R in front of their name, not the presence or absence of a Y chromosome in his or her DNA. So everybody talks about all of the ills of polarization and how this has generated such dysfunction, and that might be true, but it's also sort of rendered the sex of a candidate irrelevant when you get to election day or when you get to covering these candidates or when you get to running these campaigns. So it may very well be the case that all of these gender stereotypes still are alive and well. It's just that when it comes to voting in a partisan race, they go by the wayside because party stereotypes are so much more salient and useful. Now, I want to end, though, by telling you about other work I've done, which is about why women don't run for office. So in 2005, we wrote a book called It Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. We then wrote It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. The next edition is I'm Really Not Kidding, It Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. And here what we found was that there's a gender gap in interest in running for office, where women and men who are similarly situated, who are lawyers, business leaders, educators, political activists, are not equally likely to consider running. There's about a 16 percentage point gender gap. That was the case in 2001, it was the case in 2008, and it was the case in 2011. Women are less likely than men to say that this is something that they would ever consider doing. And part of the reason is because of their self-assessed qualifications. On paper, you wouldn't be able to tell these women and men apart, but we did national surveys, about 4,200 of them, at 3 different points in time, and notice 33% of men compared to only 21% of women say they're very qualified to run for office. Women are twice as likely as men to say that they're not at all qualified. The same thing is true when we talk about specific qualifications and skills. Knowing about policy, having professional experience, being a good public speaker. Across the board, women self-assess at lower rates than men do. And this is a way to wrap everything back up, because part of the reason they're evaluating this way has to do with the notion that they don't think they have thick enough skin to weather what they perceive to be a very, very biased political environment where discrimination is rampant. Think back to this. It makes sense that women doubt their qualifications because they believe that women don't win elections at equal rates, that the media treat them in a sexist way, that voters are unwilling to vote for them, and that what they wear and what they do is going to require a higher level of scrutiny than men. In large part because they view politics through a national lens. And so what Donald Trump does and says, and the way that Hillary Clinton responds, matters for far more than the presidential election. It shapes our attitudes and our perceptions about what it must be like across the board, even when it's not. And it shapes our perceptions about whether we ourselves could ever be good candidates. It also likely shapes the opinions of political gatekeepers. Women on both sides of the aisle are less likely than men to report that they've ever received the suggestion to run for office from a formal political gatekeeper like a party leader, elected official, or political activist, or even a colleague, family member, or friend. And that helps them run for office when they receive that suggestion. And I just want to conclude by saying the future is bleak too. 2012, this is college students in 2012. We did a national survey of high school and college students. Notice that the gender gap in political ambition among 18 to 25-year-olds is the same size as it is among well-established adults who are working in these professions. The good news is that there doesn't really seem to be a gender gap in high school. We're basically calling this the freshman dorm effect. The minute you step foot on a college campus and you're free to be, men's ambition to do everything regarding power goes through the roof. Not that surprising. You look around and you know your friends. But what this means is that it's important to encourage young women, especially at this time, to consider running for office and to start debunking these myths, because there are clearly long-term ramifications. And so if you get nothing else from this, I just want to highlight that what we see at the presidential level and what we're learning about as relevant at the presidential level is. And those episodes of bias and discrimination and misogyny are real and they exist. But fortunately, US politics is still decentralized enough, and so much of it happens at these lower levels of office under far less scrutiny, that most women's experiences and most male candidates don't behave or receive the treatment that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have been receiving and giving. Thank you.